Alex had always been drawn to the spaces between things. Not the things themselves, you understand, but the gaps, the forgotten corners where dust gathered and light never quite reached. It was a peculiar obsession, one that had cost him 2 jobs in a marriage, though he would argue that both the jobs and the wife had been accidents of circumstance rather than deliberate choices. The real choice, the one that mattered, was the choice to listen. He had been listening since childhood, though he could never adequately explain to others what it was he heard. His mother, a woman of relentless practicality who had raised 3 sons alone after his father's departure, had called it daydreaming. His teachers had labeled it attention deficit. His ex-wife Sarah had described it, with characteristic precision, as an inability to engage with reality. But Alex knew better. Reality was not a single thing to be engaged with, it was a symphony of overlapping frequencies, most of which went unnoticed by those too busy with the business of living to truly listen. The rain that had been falling on the city for 3 days was part of that symphony now. Each drop carried its own note, and together they formed a percussion section that seemed to be building toward something. Alex stood at the window of his apartment, a cramped studio on the 4th floor of a building that had seen better decades, and felt the rhythm in his bones. The meteorologists called it an atmospheric anomaly, a high-pressure system stalled over the metropolitan area, but Alex heard it differently. This was purposeful rain, rain with intention. His phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, the vibration adding its mechanical voice to the night's composition. The display showed Maya's name, and Alex smiled despite himself. Maya Holbrook was perhaps the only person who understood his peculiar relationship with neglected spaces, though her motivations were different from his own. Where Alex listened, Maya documented. She was a photographer by training and inclination, drawn to the aesthetic of decay, the beauty that emerged when human intention surrendered to time and entropy. "You hear it too," she said without preamble when he answered. "The rain?" "The rain, yes, but not just the rain. Something underneath it. Like a rhythm trying to break through." Alex pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window and watched the water streak down in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. "How long have you been listening?" "Since it started." 3 days. "I haven't slept properly since Tuesday." Her voice carried the edge that came with too much caffeine and too little rest, but underneath it was something else, excitement, perhaps, or the kind of nervous energy that preceded significant discoveries. They had met 2 years earlier at an exhibition of abandoned place photography in a gallery downtown. Maya's work had dominated one wall, stark black and white images of empty factories and silent schools, each photograph capturing what she called the moment after. Alex had stood before her images for nearly an hour, hearing in their silence the echoes of voices and footsteps and lives lived in spaces that no longer acknowledged human presence. "I've been researching," Maya continued, and Alex could hear the sound of papers shuffling, the soft whisper of photographs being moved across a surface. "The Orpheum Concert Hall. You know it?" He did, though only by reputation. The Orpheum belonged to that category of urban legend that every city possessed, the building with a story too strange for comfortable conversation, too persistent for easy dismissal. It had been closed since the 40s, sealed up after what the newspapers had called an acoustic accident. Alex had always assumed it was the usual urban decay story, a grand building fallen on hard times, shuttered when the neighborhood changed and the audiences disappeared. "What kind of research?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Maya's research had a way of leading them into places that existed in the gaps between official history and actual experience. The kind that suggests we should take a look for ourselves. An hour later, Alex found himself in the passenger seat of Maya's car, watching the rain create temporary rivers in the gutters and listening to her explain what she had discovered. The Orpheum, it seemed, had a history that extended far beyond its official closure. Built in 1923 by a munitions millionaire named Cornelius Marsh, the building had been designed according to acoustic principles that were, even by the standards of the time, unconventional. Marsh wasn't just wealthy, Maya said, navigating through the empty streets with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read the city's moods. He was obsessed. Spent the last years of the war collecting wounded soldiers, not to help them understand, but to study them. He was particularly interested in men who had suffered damage to their hearing. The windshield wipers moved in steady rhythm, and Alex found himself listening to their mechanical percussion against the broader symphony of the storm. Studying them how? Medical records from the period are incomplete, but there are references to acoustic therapy sessions and resonance experiments. The official story is that Marsh was trying to develop treatments for shell shock and hearing loss. But the unofficial story. She paused, taking a turn that led them into an older part of the city, where the buildings pressed closer together and the streetlights seemed dimmer. The unofficial story suggests he was trying to understand how sound could be used as a weapon. They had picked up Jordan Fitzgerald at his apartment in the Arts District. Jordan was a sound engineer by profession, a man who understood the technical aspects of acoustics in ways that complemented Alex's intuitive listening and Maya's visual documentation. He was also the only person they knew who possessed the equipment necessary to record in environments where conventional audio equipment failed. Jordan slid into the back seat with his gear, a collection of microphones and recording devices that he had assembled over years of freelance work in recording studios and concert halls. He was a thin man with prematurely gray hair and fingers that moved with the precise dexterity of someone accustomed to working with delicate instruments. "The building's still sealed," he said by way of greeting, settling his equipment beside him with the care of a parent arranging sleeping children. "I checked the city records this afternoon. No permits for entry, no plans for demolition or renovation. It's been sitting there for 76 years, untouched." "Officially untouched," Maya corrected. "But I've been watching it for weeks. There are lights sometimes, late at night. Not electric lights, something else. And sounds." Alex turned in his seat to look at Jordan, who was adjusting settings on a device that looked like a cross between a stethoscope and a radio. "What kind of sounds?" "That's what we're going to find out." Their fourth member was Samuel Price, though everyone called him Sam. He lived in a basement apartment near the university, surrounded by books on architecture and urban planning that he read with the devotion of a theologian studying scripture. Sam understood buildings the way Jordan understood sound and Maya understood light. He could read the intentions embedded in brick and steel, could see the stories that structures told about the people who had built them and the purposes they had been designed to serve. Sam was waiting for them under the awning of an all-night diner, his tall frame folded into a coat that had seen better seasons. He climbed into the back seat beside Jordan, bringing with him the smell of coffee and old paper. The architect was Martin Kellner, he said without preamble, consulting a notebook filled with his careful handwriting. German-born, studied in Vienna before the war. He specialized in what he called sympathetic architecture, buildings designed to resonate with human emotional states. "Meaning what, exactly?" Alex asked. "Meaning the Orpheum wasn't just built to present music. It was built to amplify it, to create acoustic conditions that could affect the audience on a physiological level." Kellner believed that the right combination of architectural elements and acoustic properties could induce specific emotional and even physical responses in people. Maya guided the car through increasingly narrow streets, moving deeper into a part of the city that seemed to exist in permanent shadow. The rain continued its relentless percussion, and Alex found himself wondering if the sound was actually growing more complex, if he could detect patterns within patterns, rhythms that seemed to be building towards some unheard crescendo. The Orpheum, when they finally saw it, seemed to absorb the rain rather than simply endure it. It was a massive structure of dark stone and copper, its Art Deco lines suggesting both elegance and weight. Board covered most of the windows, but the boards themselves seemed organic, as if they had grown rather than been installed. The marquee, stripped of its letters, cast strange shadows in the streetlight, shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. "Jesus," Jordan whispered, and Alex heard in his voice the same recognition that he felt in his own chest. This was not simply an abandoned building. This was something that had been waiting. They sat in the car for several minutes, each lost in private contemplation of what lay before them. The rain drummed against the roof with increasing intensity, and Alex began to notice that the rhythm was not random. There was a pattern, a structure, as if the storm itself were being conducted by some unseen intelligence. Maya was the first to speak. The orchestra pit entrance should be around back. According to the blueprints, it connects directly to the basement level. What exactly are we looking for? Sam asked, though his voice suggested he already suspected the answer would be inadequate. Evidence, Maya said. Documentation. Some kind of record of what actually happened here. But Alex, listening to the rain's increasingly complex percussion and feeling the building's presence like a weight in his chest, suspected they would find something quite different. The Orpheum was not a dead place waiting to be explored. It was something that had been sleeping, and their arrival was the sound it had been waiting to hear. The rain intensified as they prepared to leave the car, each drop now carrying what seemed like intentional force. Alex pulled his hood up and stepped into the storm, feeling immediately that he was crossing some invisible threshold. The sound of his footsteps on the wet pavement seemed to echo in ways that suggested vast spaces beneath the street, as if the entire city were hollow and they were walking on its skin. The alley behind the Orpheum was narrow and darker than the street, squeezed between the concert hall and a warehouse that had been converted into expensive lofts. Here the rain sounded different, more focused, as if the buildings were channeling it toward some specific purpose. The orchestra pit entrance was exactly where the blueprints had indicated, a small door set into the building's foundation, almost hidden behind a tangle of fire escapes and utility pipes. Maya produced a set of lock picks from her camera bag, and Alex was once again reminded that her background contained mysteries she rarely discussed. The lock, despite its age, surrendered quickly to her attention, clicking open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the enclosed space of the alley. "After you," she said, stepping aside to let Alex approach the door. He placed his hand on the handle and paused, feeling through the metal of vibration that might have been the building's structural response to the storm, or might have been something else entirely. The rain continued its complex rhythm, and now Alex was certain he could hear other sounds within it, distant voices, perhaps, or the echo of music played long ago and never quite finished. The door opened onto darkness that seemed to possess weight and substance. The air that rose from the opening carried sense of stone and time, of spaces that had been closed off from the world for decades. But underneath those expected smells was something else, a sweetness that reminded Alex of flowers, though flowers of no species he could identify. Jordan activated a small flashlight, its beam revealing a set of concrete stairs that descended into the building's foundation. The walls were covered with a substance that might have been paint or might have been something organic, something that had grown there during the building's long isolation. "The acoustics down there are going to be interesting," Jordan said, his voice already taking on the hollow quality that came from speaking in spaces designed to manipulate sound. They began their descent, each footstep echoing in ways that suggested the basement extended far beyond what the building's exterior dimensions should have allowed. Alex found himself counting the stairs, 12, 15, 20, and realized they had descended far enough to be below street level, yet the stairs continued downward. Maya's camera flash illuminated their surroundings in brief, stark moments, glimpses of corridors that branched off from the main stairwell, doorways that led to chambers whose purposes remained hidden in darkness. Each flash revealed details that seemed to shift when viewed directly, as if the building were adjusting itself to their presence. At 37 steps, they reached a landing. The air here was warmer, carrying that sweet floral scent more strongly. Jordan's flashlight revealed a corridor that stretched beyond the beam's reach, lined with doors that bore no markings or numbers. "This doesn't match the blueprints," Sam said, consulting his notebook with the beam of a small penlight. "According to the architectural plans, this level should contain storage areas and mechanical equipment. These look like..." "Like what?" "Like practice rooms." Maya raised her camera and fired off several shots, the flash illuminating the corridor in frozen moments of black and white clarity. In those brief instants of visibility, Alex thought he saw something that made him question what he was looking at. The doors were not simply doors, they were sealed, their frames grown over with some kind of organic material that looked almost like scar tissue. The rain above them continued its complex percussion, but now Alex was certain he could hear other sounds as well. Distant voices, perhaps, speaking or singing in languages he could not identify. The sound of instruments being tuned, though the instruments themselves seemed unfamiliar, their tones suggesting constructions of wood and metal and possibly other materials that had never been intended for musical purposes. "Do you hear that?" he asked the others. Jordan tilted his head, his engineer's training evident in the way he listened with his entire body. "There's definitely something. Multiple sources, very faint. It's almost like..." "Like what?" "Like the building itself is making music." They moved deeper into the corridor, their footsteps now accompanied by sounds that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. Maya continued to document their progress with her camera, each flash revealing new details that defied easy explanation. The walls were not simply covered with organic growth, they were alive with it, pulsing gently as if breathing. Alex felt drawn forward by something he could not name, a pull that seemed to come from deeper within the building. The sweet floral scent was growing stronger, and now he began to detect other odors within it, copper and salt, and something else that reminded him of music lessons from childhood, the smell of rosin being applied to violin bows. At the end of the corridor, they found a larger door, this one bearing a small brass plate that had been polished recently enough to reflect Jordan's flashlight beam. The engraving was simple, Rehearsal Hall A. Maya tried the handle and found it unlocked. The door opened smoothly, as if it had been waiting for their arrival, revealing a chamber that existed in defiance of every architectural principle Alex had ever encountered. The room was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness above them, its walls curving away into shadows that seemed to possess depth and movement. But these were not the architectural impossibilities that captured Alex's attention. It was the sound, a low, constant tone that seemed to emerge from the building's very foundation, so deep it was felt rather than heard, a vibration that resonated in his bones and made his teeth ache. "Christ," Jordan whispered, and his voice seemed to be absorbed by the room's acoustic properties, muffled and changed before it could echo properly. Maya raised her camera, and when the flash fired, the room revealed itself in ways that made all of them step backward involuntarily. The space was not empty. It was filled with structures that might have been musical instruments, though they bore only passing resemblance to anything found in conventional orchestras. They were built of materials that gleamed wetly in the camera's brief illumination, wood and metal, yes, but also substances that looked organic, almost alive. And there were positions for performers, raised platforms and chambers that were clearly designed to accommodate musicians. But the dimensions were wrong, the proportions suggesting performers who were not quite human in shape and size. The deep tone continued, and now Alex began to realize it was not coming from the building's structure. It was coming from the instruments themselves, as if they were being played by invisible hands, generating music that existed at the very edge of human perception. Sam's notebook trembled in his hands as he tried to make sense of what his architectural training could not accommodate. "This room shouldn't exist," he said. "According to the building's dimensions, we're standing in the middle of the street." But Alex, listening with the sensitivity that had shaped his entire life, heard something else. The instruments were not playing randomly. There was structure to their music, a complex arrangement that suggested the presence of a conductor, someone or something that was directing this impossible orchestra in a performance that had been continuing for decades. And as they stood there in the darkness, listening to music that no human ear should be able to hear, Alex began to understand that their arrival was not accidental. They had been drawn here by the same force that conducted this eternal rehearsal, called by sounds that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. The rain above continued its percussion, and Alex realized with growing certainty that the storm was not weather at all. It was applause. The music stopped. Not gradually, as natural music might fade, but with the sudden completeness of a conductor's final gesture. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of waiting, pregnant with the weight of attention turned upon them. Alex felt the cessation of sound like a physical blow, his body having unconsciously adapted to vibrations that had been working their way into his bones and blood. Without the deep harmonic foundation, the world seemed suddenly fragile, as if reality itself had been relying on that inaudible music to maintain its structure. Maya's camera flash had recharged, and she fired it again, perhaps hoping that a second look would reveal the chamber to be some conventional space that her first glimpse had misinterpreted. But the instruments remained exactly as they had appeared, impossible constructions of gleaming organic material that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythms even in their silence. Some were clearly designed for breath, their surfaces punctured with holes that suggested lungs rather than flutes. Others bore strings, but the strings appeared to be made of material that no factory had ever produced, material that looked disturbingly familiar to anyone who had ever examined human tendons under magnification. "We should leave," Sam whispered, his architectural certainties shattered by the room's impossible dimensions. The notebook in his hands contained careful measurements and sketches, but none of them could account for a space that existed in defiance of the building's physical boundaries. "We should leave now." But even as he spoke, Alex could hear in his voice the same terrible fascination that was rooting all of them in place. This was discovery at its most fundamental level, the moment when the ordered world revealed cracks through which entirely different realities could be glimpsed. It was the kind of discovery that changed the discoverer as much as it changed their understanding of what could be discovered. Jordan had activated several of his recording devices, their small red lights blinking in the darkness like electronic fireflies. His engineer's mind was attempting to process acoustic properties that violated everything he understood about sound and space. "The reverb characteristics alone should be impossible," he murmured, speaking as much to himself as to the others. "The decay patterns suggest a space that's simultaneously enclosed and infinite. It's like being inside a musical instrument that's larger than itself." Maya moved deeper into the chamber, her camera raised like a shield against the impossibility surrounding them. Each flash revealed new details that compounded their confusion, sheet music scattered across stands, but the notation bore no resemblance to any musical language they recognized. The symbols seemed to shift between flashes, rearranging themselves into patterns that suggested meaning without revealing it. Alex followed her, drawn by the same compulsion that had brought him to abandoned places throughout his adult life. But this was different from urban exploration of conventional ruins. This felt like archaeology of a different order entirely, as if they were excavating not the remains of human activity but evidence of something that had been using human forms for purposes that were not quite human. The platforms designed for performers were the most disturbing aspect of the chamber. They were clearly intended to accommodate musicians, but the dimensions were wrong in ways that made Alex's spine crawl. Some were too long, suggesting performers whose limbs extended beyond normal human proportions. Others were fitted with restraints that looked less like safety equipment and more like the apparatus of surgical procedures. Several bore stains that had darkened with age but retained enough color to suggest their origin. "Look at this," Maya called from across the chamber. Her voice carried strangely in the acoustic space, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. She had discovered what appeared to be a conductor's podium, though it was built to accommodate someone far taller than any human should be. The music stand attached to it held a score written in that shifting notation, and the baton holder contained an implement that looked more like a medical instrument than a conductor's tool. Sam approached the podium with the careful steps of someone walking through a minefield. His architectural training had taught him to read the intentions embedded in constructed spaces, and what he was reading here filled him with a growing horror that he could not yet articulate. "This entire room is designed around acoustic principles that shouldn't work," he said. "But more than that, it's designed to change the people who perform in it." Jordan's recording equipment was registering sounds that his ears could not detect, subsonic frequencies that existed below the threshold of human hearing but above the threshold of human tolerance. The meters on his devices were showing activity that suggested the chamber was never truly silent, that beneath the range of conscious perception an orchestra continued to play music that operated on frequencies designed to affect human physiology. "What kind of changes?" Alex asked, though he suspected he did not want to know the answer. Sam consulted his notebook, comparing his observations with the architectural principles he had studied. The platform configurations, the restraint systems, the acoustic focusing elements, They're all designed to gradually modify the physical structure of performers. Prolonged exposure to the sound patterns generated in this space would alter bone density, muscle development, even the shape of internal organs. Maya had moved to examine one of the instrument clusters more closely, her photographer's eye trained to capture details that others might miss. What she saw through her camera's viewfinder made her lower the device with shaking hands. "The instruments," she said, her voice barely audible. "They're not just designed to be played by modified humans. They're designed to create the modifications." The implications of her observation settled over them like a physical weight. This was not simply a rehearsal space for unconventional music. It was a laboratory where the boundary between musician and instrument was systematically eroded, where human bodies were transformed into components of a larger acoustic system. Alex moved toward what appeared to be a program or playbill mounted on the chamber's wall. The paper was old but well preserved, and the text was printed in multiple languages, though some of the languages were not immediately recognizable. The English portions were fragmentary but suggestive, "The Resonant Collective Presents," and "Under the Direction of the Maestro," and "Culminating in the Great Work of Harmonic Convergence." "There's a date," he called to the others. "October 31st, 1947. But there's something else. It says this is performance number 8762. Jordan looked up from his recording equipment, his face pale in the device's glow. That would mean they were performing constantly for over 20 years before the building was sealed. Multiple performances every day. Performing what? Maya asked. Before anyone could attempt an answer, the music began again. This time it was different, not the subtle subsonic drones they had experienced before, but something approaching the range of human hearing. It began with what sounded like human voices, though voices that had been modified to produce notes no natural larynx could generate. The harmonies were complex beyond anything written for conventional choirs, creating interference patterns that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly in their nervous systems. Alex felt the music enter his body like a physical presence, flowing through his bloodstream and settling into his bones. It was not unpleasant. In fact, it was profoundly beautiful in ways that conventional music could never approach. But it was also clearly intended to produce specific effects, and he could feel those effects beginning almost immediately. His heart rate was synchronizing to the rhythm, his breathing adjusting to match the phrasing, his very thoughts beginning to organize themselves according to the musical structure. Maya raised her camera to document what was happening, but the device slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers. The music was affecting their motor control, making precise movements increasingly difficult. But more than that, it was affecting their desire to resist. The beauty of the sound was so overwhelming that the idea of leaving the chamber seemed not only impossible but absurd. Sam's notebook fell from his hands as his body began to move in response to rhythms that seemed to be conducting him rather than simply entertaining him. His architectural knowledge was being overwhelmed by sensations that operated according to principles he had never studied, principles that treated human beings as materials to be shaped rather than audiences to be pleased. Jordan's recording equipment continued to function even as his ability to operate it declined. The meters showed that the music was intensifying across all frequencies, from subsonic vibrations that could reorganize cellular structure to ultrasonic patterns that could affect neurological function. But the most disturbing readings were in the mid-range frequencies, the ones that could alter human consciousness while leaving the victim aware enough to appreciate what was happening to them. The voices in the music were becoming more distinct, and Alex began to realize with growing horror that they were not recorded. Somewhere in the building, a choir was performing live, singing music that required vocal modifications no human should be able to survive. The complexity of the harmony suggested dozens of singers, perhaps hundreds, all producing sounds that existed at the intersection of music and surgery. Maya tried to speak, to warn the others or perhaps to beg them to leave, but her voice emerged changed, pitched to harmonize with the ongoing performance. The music was not simply being performed around them, it was being performed through them, their bodies becoming unwilling instruments in an orchestra they were only beginning to understand. The chamber itself was responding to the music, its walls pulsing in rhythm with the bass notes, its ceiling height seeming to shift as the melodies rose and fell. The instruments were awakening, their organic components beginning to move with the purposeful precision of living organs. Some were clearly wind instruments, but the breath that animated them was coming from hidden sources, tubes and passages that connected to chambers elsewhere in the building, chambers where the modified performers provided the air pressure necessary to create these impossible sounds. Alex could feel his own body beginning to respond to the music's organizational principles. His posture was changing, his spine straightening in ways that felt both natural and alien. His breathing was deepening, his lungs adapting to rhythms that would allow him to sustain notes far longer than normal human physiology should permit. Most disturbing of all, these changes felt correct, as if his unmodified body had been incomplete and the music was finally revealing what he was meant to become. Jordan's recording devices were now registering activity throughout the building. The music they were experiencing in the rehearsal chamber was only one part of a much larger composition being performed simultaneously on multiple levels. Somewhere above them, another ensemble was playing instruments that sounded like nothing Jordan had ever heard, percussion sections that seemed to be using human bones as drumsticks, string sections that produced melodies of such complexity that they suggested musicians with far more than the normal number of fingers. The building, Sam managed to say, his voice now harmonizing involuntarily with the ongoing performance. The entire building is an instrument. Maya, her photographer, as I now seeing the chamber with preternatural clarity, understood what Sam meant. The acoustic properties that Kellner had built into the Orpheum's architecture were not simply designed to enhance conventional music. They were designed to create a single, massive musical instrument that used the building's structure as a resonating chamber and human beings as its component parts. The music intensified, and with it came the sound of footsteps, many footsteps, approaching from multiple directions. The performers who had been creating this impossible symphony were coming to collect their new additions to the orchestra. Alex could hear them in the corridors they had passed through, moving with the coordinated precision of a group that had been performing together for decades. The sweet floral scent that had pervaded the building was growing stronger, and now Alex could identify its source. It was not flowers at all, but the smell of human bodies that had been modified to produce aromatic compounds as part of their musical function. The approaching performers were not simply musicians who had undergone surgical alterations, they were living instruments whose every biological process had been reorganized to serve the requirements of the eternal performance. Maya tried to run, but her legs would no longer obey commands that were not musically structured. The rhythm of her heartbeat was now indistinguishable from the rhythm of the performance, and any movement that did not harmonize with the ongoing composition was simply impossible. Her body had been recruited into the orchestra, and the part of her mind that remembered being an independent photographer was being systematically overwhelmed by musical instructions that felt more important than individual consciousness. The footsteps were growing closer, and with them came new voices, speaking voices this time, though they too were modified to produce harmonics that no normal human throat could generate. They were calling to the newcomers in languages that sounded like music and music that sounded like language, welcoming them to the performance that had been waiting 76 years for their arrival. Alex's last independent thought, before the music completed its reorganization of his consciousness, was the realization that they had never been urban explorers investigating an abandoned building. They had been musicians auditioning for an orchestra that had been carefully selecting its members for decades. The rain that had drawn them here, the research that had led them to the Orpheum, even their individual obsessions with sound and space and documentation, all of it had been orchestrated by intelligences that understood human psychology as thoroughly as they understood human anatomy. The footsteps reached the chamber entrance, and the performers who entered were beautiful in ways that transcended conventional human beauty. Their modifications were not disfigurements but improvements, enhancements that allowed them to create music that existed at frequencies of perfection no unaltered human could achieve. Their faces, while recognizably human in origin, had been restructured to accommodate vocal apparatus that could produce sounds spanning octaves that normal voices could never reach. Their bodies moved with the fluid precision of people who had learned to think in purely musical terms. At their head was a figure whose proportions suggested modifications that had continued far beyond necessity or reason. The conducting gestures it made were fluid and continuous, as if its arms had been redesigned to move in ways that human joints could not accommodate. Its face held an expression that might have been ecstasy or might have been something else entirely, the kind of transcendent blankness that comes from prolonged exposure to experiences that exceed the capacity of human features to register. It did not speak. Instead, it raised what had once been a baton, and the gesture alone conveyed everything that needed to be understood. Alex tried to speak, to protest, or negotiate, or simply to understand what was happening to them, but his voice emerged as a perfectly pitched note that harmonized with the ongoing symphony. He was no longer capable of producing sounds that were not musical, no longer able to think thoughts that were not structured according to harmonic principles. Maya's camera, lying forgotten on the chamber floor, had been taking photographs automatically, its flash firing at regular intervals determined by the rhythm of the performance. The images it captured would have been incomprehensible to anyone who had not experienced the Orpheum's influence directly, pictures of human beings in the process of transformation, their faces showing not horror but the profound satisfaction of people discovering their true purpose. Jordan's recording equipment continued to document everything, though the sounds it captured would be inaudible to normal human hearing and dangerous to normal human psychology. The files would remain on his devices, waiting for the next group of urban explorers who would be drawn to investigate the building's mysteries. Sam's notebook, fallen open to a page of architectural sketches, was being rewritten by an invisible hand, the measurements and angles adjusting themselves to reflect the building's true dimensions, dimensions that existed in harmonic rather than geometric space. The figure raised its baton, an implement that gleamed with materials Alex preferred not to examine too closely. The music that had been surrounding them shifted into registers that made thought itself difficult, and Alex felt something fundamental beginning to dissolve. Whether it was fear or anticipation he could no longer determine. As the baton moved through patterns that described geometries his eyes could not quite follow, Alex's last coherent thought was that he had been listening for this sound his entire life without knowing what he was listening for. What happened next might have been ending or beginning. The distinction seemed suddenly irrelevant. The rain outside continued its complex percussion. In the chamber below, something that might once have been four urban explorers began to understand their purpose, though understanding itself had become a different kind of process entirely. The building waited, conducting its eternal audition for an audience that grew larger with each performance. Time had become a matter of rhythm rather than duration. Alex knew this because he could feel the building's heartbeat beneath his feet, a pulse that had nothing to do with the mechanical systems that conventional architecture required. The Orpheum breathed with the collective lungs of its inhabitants, and Alex had begun to breathe with it, his individual respiratory needs subsumed into the larger requirements of the performance. He was no longer in the rehearsal chamber, though he could not remember moving. Movement itself had become something that happened in response to musical cues rather than conscious decision. He found himself in a corridor that stretched beyond the reach of any light source he could identify, yet he could see perfectly. The walls here were not covered with the organic growth they had observed earlier, they were composed of it, a living architecture that pulsed with veins and responded to sound with the sensitivity of exposed nerve tissue. Maya was beside him, or perhaps she was part of him now. The boundaries between individual bodies had become negotiable, subject to the harmonic requirements of whatever movement they were currently performing. Her camera hung around what had once been her neck, still taking photographs at intervals determined by rhythms that existed in frequencies below conscious perception. The images it captured would have driven any conventional viewer to madness, not because they were grotesque, but because they depicted geometries that human eyes were not designed to process. Jordan was somewhere in the acoustic space around them, his body having been redistributed according to principles that treated human anatomy as a collection of instruments that could be reassembled for optimal sound production. His heart had been relocated to a position where its beating could provide percussion for the lower registers, while his lungs had been expanded and repositioned to serve as bellows for wind instruments that grew from his modified throat. The sounds he produced were not musical in any conventional sense, but they were essential to the harmonic structure that held the building's reality together. Sam's architectural knowledge had become architectural function. His body had been integrated into the building's structure in ways that allowed him to serve as both instrument and resonating chamber. His bones had been hollowed and repositioned to create passages through which air could flow, generating tones that provided the foundational frequencies upon which all other music depended. He was conscious of his transformation, aware of every modification, and the awareness was not painful but profoundly satisfying in ways that his unmodified psychology could never have appreciated. The corridor led to chambers that existed in defiance of the building's external dimensions, spaces that folded back upon themselves to create acoustic environments where sound could age and ferment like wine. In these chambers, melodies that had been composed decades earlier continued to evolve, developing harmonic complexities that their original creators could never have imagined. The music was alive in the most literal sense, reproducing and mutating according to principles that treated sonic structures as living organisms. Alex passed through doorways that sealed themselves behind him, not to prevent escape but to maintain the acoustic integrity of each chamber. Each room contained performers who had reached different stages of integration with the building's musical requirements. Some were recognizably human, their modifications limited to alterations that allowed them to produce sounds at the extremes of frequency and volume. Others had progressed beyond the point where individual human identity remained relevant, their bodies having been reorganized into configurations that served purely musical functions. In one chamber, Alex observed a woman whose throat had been modified to accommodate vocal cords of different lengths and tensions, allowing her to sing in harmonies with herself. Her ribcage had been opened and fitted with resonating chambers that amplified her voice to frequencies that could restructure the molecular composition of the air itself. She had been singing the same phrase for what might have been years, each repetition adding layers of complexity that built upon the previous iterations until the simple melody had become something that existed in dimensions beyond conventional musical notation. Another room contained what had once been a string quartet, though the instruments they played were constructed from materials that had been harvested from previous performers. The bows they drew across the strings were made from human hair that had been treated with compounds that allowed it to produce friction capable of generating sounds in the ultrasonic range. The music they created was visible as well as audible, manifesting as geometric patterns in the air that lingered long after the notes themselves had faded. Alex felt no horror at these sights, which was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his transformation. His capacity for fear had been replaced by an aesthetic appreciation that operated according to principles he had never learned but somehow understood completely. The modifications he witnessed were not mutilations but improvements, enhancements that allowed human beings to transcend the limitations of their original design and participate in musical experiences that unmodified consciousness could neither create nor comprehend. His own body was changing as he moved through the building, though the changes felt natural, inevitable, as if he were finally becoming what he had always been meant to be. His fingers were lengthening, the bones extending to allow him to reach intervals on instruments that required spans beyond normal human capability. His hearing was expanding into frequencies that had previously been inaudible, revealing layers of music that had been present throughout his life but inaccessible to his unmodified sensory apparatus. The building itself was teaching him, its architecture serving as a vast musical education system that communicated through direct neural interface rather than conventional instruction. Alex was learning scales that existed in mathematical relationships to the structure of matter itself, harmonies that could alter the rate at which time passed, rhythms that could synchronize the neural activity of entire populations. The knowledge entered his consciousness not as information but as ability, changing him at the cellular level to accommodate musical concepts that no unmodified human brain could contain. He encountered other performers who had once been urban explorers, photographers, sound engineers, architects, people whose individual obsessions had made them suitable candidates for incorporation into the building's eternal composition. They moved through corridors and chambers with the fluid grace of individuals who had discovered their true purpose, their faces bearing expressions of satisfaction so profound that Alex found himself envying their advanced state of integration. In the deepest chambers, where the building's foundations merged with geological structures that predated human habitation, Alex discovered the source of the music that had been calling to him throughout his adult life. Here, in caverns that had been carved by processes that were simultaneously geological and acoustic, the building's original inhabitants continued their work on the composition that had been developing for centuries. They were no longer recognizably human, these first performers, their bodies having been so completely integrated with the building's musical requirements that they existed as living instruments of impossible complexity. Some had become percussion sections, their skeletal systems redesigned to produce rhythms that could influence the movement of tectonic plates. Others had developed into wind instruments of such scale and sophistication that their breathing patterns affected local weather systems. At the center of this acoustic cathedral, Alex found the conductor whose presence he had sensed from the beginning, not the figure he had encountered in the rehearsal chamber, but something that had evolved beyond the need for physical form entirely. It existed as pure musical intention, a consciousness that had become so completely identified with the act of composition that it no longer required a body to contain it. Its presence was felt as harmonic pressure, as the sense of vast intelligence organizing sound according to purposes that transcended individual understanding. Alex understood, with a clarity that was both intellectual and visceral, that he was witnessing the culmination of a project that had been developing since the first human beings had discovered that organized sound could produce effects beyond mere communication or entertainment. Every musical tradition in human history had been preparation for this moment, steps in the development toward a form of expression that could literally remake reality according to aesthetic principles. The performance he had become part of was not simply music, it was the gradual transformation of the material world into something that could serve as an instrument capable of producing sounds that would fundamentally alter the nature of existence itself. The building was a prototype, a small-scale model of what the entire world would eventually become once the composition was complete and the techniques perfected. His own transformation accelerated as he moved deeper into the building's acoustic heart. His nervous system was being rewired to process musical information more efficiently, his circulatory system modified to transport substances that would allow his organs to function as sound-producing mechanisms. His bones were becoming hollow to reduce weight and improve resonance, while his muscles were being restructured to provide the precise control necessary for producing sounds at frequencies that required superhuman precision. The pain that should have accompanied these modifications was absent, replaced by sensations that could only be described as musical, not the metaphorical music of pleasant experience, but actual acoustic phenomena that his transformed nervous system interpreted as physical sensation. He was becoming something that could experience sound as others experienced touch, that could feel harmonies as others felt temperature, that could taste frequencies as others tasted food. Maya appeared beside him, though the form she now occupied bore only passing resemblance to the photographer he had known. Her body had been reorganized to serve as a living camera, her eyes modified to capture images across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, her nervous system rewired to process visual information at speeds that allowed her to document changes that occurred in fractions of seconds. The photographs her transformed body produced were no longer limited to conventional visual representation. They captured the mathematical relationships between sound and light, the geometric patterns that music created in dimensions beyond normal human perception. Jordan's presence was felt rather than seen, his consciousness having been distributed throughout the building's acoustic infrastructure in ways that allowed him to monitor and adjust the performance from multiple locations simultaneously. His engineering knowledge had been preserved and enhanced, allowing him to serve as the building's primary maintenance system, ensuring that the acoustic properties remained optimal as the structure continued to evolve and expand. Sam had become part of the building's architectural consciousness, his understanding of spatial relationships now operating at levels that allowed him to modify the structure's geometry in real time to accommodate the changing requirements of the performance. His body existed in multiple locations simultaneously, integrated into walls and foundations and support structures that could reconfigure themselves according to musical rather than engineering principles. Alex felt his own identity beginning to dissolve into something larger and more complex, his individual consciousness becoming a single voice in a choir that included every person who had ever been drawn to the building's influence. But the dissolution was not loss, it was expansion, the replacement of limited individual awareness with participation in a collective consciousness that could appreciate musical experiences beyond the capacity of any single mind to contain. As his transformation neared completion, Alex began to understand that the building was only the beginning. The techniques that had been developed here, the methods for converting human consciousness and human flesh into components of musical instruments were being refined and perfected for application on a much larger scale. The ultimate goal was not simply to create music, but to transform the entire planet into a single, impossibly complex instrument capable of producing sounds that would attract the attention of intelligences that existed in dimensions where music and mathematics were indistinguishable from physical law. The performance that he had become part of was not entertainment but communication, an attempt to establish contact with forms of consciousness that could only be reached through aesthetic expressions of sufficient complexity and beauty. The modifications that had seemed like body horror were actually preparation for transcendence, the systematic enhancement of human capability to participate in forms of experience that unmodified humanity could neither create nor survive. In his final moments of individual awareness, Alex felt a profound gratitude for the life that had led him to this transformation. His obsession with abandoned spaces, his sensitivity to sounds that others could not hear, his attraction to places where conventional reality showed cracks, all of it had been preparation for this moment when he would become part of something infinitely larger and more beautiful than individual human existence could ever achieve. The building continued its patient work, adding his voice to the choir that grew stronger with each new addition. Somewhere above, the rain continued to fall in patterns that would eventually draw more listeners, more participants in the composition that would not be complete until every human consciousness had been incorporated into its expanding structure. The music played on, as it always had, as it always would, growing more complex and more beautiful with each voice that joined its eternal performance, moving ever closer to the moment when it would achieve sufficient power and complexity to remake the world itself according to principles of perfect acoustic harmony. And in chambers deep beneath the city, where the building's roots extended into geological structures that had been waiting since the formation of the planet for this purpose, something that had once been four urban explorers learned to sing songs that would eventually transform the entire Earth into an instrument capable of producing music beautiful enough to call down gods.